One of the casualties of modern industrialism is the individual craftsman. Because automated machinery produces goods more swiftly and cheaply, his work has been largely priced out of the marketplace. And there is little need for his specialized skills on an assembly line. But there will always be those who love to work with their hands and who will accept the long apprenticeship that mastery of a craft requires. Now, as in the past, the building of fine musical instruments demands expert individual workmanship. And one of the remarkable events of our time is the flowering in America of the centuries-old art of building harpsichords. Although modern builders use electrically powered tools and new materials have replaced some of those used in old instruments, the making of harpsichords proceeds today very much as it did in the 18th century, when it was a highly organized craft, and a single shop might turn out dozens of instruments a year. Even then, there was a division of labor, and workmen were assigned different specialized tasks in the building process. Modern builders have come to appreciate the methods and technologies of their predecessors. The most professional shops use the go bar, a very old, ingeniously simple way to exert pressure on materials, to clamp objects together without using clamps. Thousands of Americans have built their own harpsichords from kits designed by professional builders. At one time, almost all the professional builders in America were clustered along the Atlantic seaboard. Now there are workshops in almost every part of the country, and each year new builders announce the availability of their instruments. John Lake was drawn toward the building of harpsichords when he was asked to tune and regulate those at the Oberlin College Conservatory of Music. Lake brings to the building of harpsichords a heritage of old-world craftsmanship gained in the Netherlands, where he was apprenticed as a boy to an organ builder. He first came to America to install and repair organs. Settled permanently in the United States, he now builds harpsichords in Oberlin, Ohio. Lake uses plans and materials such as soundboards provided by Frank Hubbard. Hubbard's workshop in Waltham, Massachusetts, turns out a variety of concert instruments and kits of harpsichords and forte pianos. A renowned scholar whose book on the harpsichord is the standard reference work, Hubbard is often asked to restore antique instruments like this Rooker's Virginals. Of equal stature as a builder and restorer is William Dowd of Cambridge, Massachusetts, who with Hubbard struck out in the new direction that was to revolutionize harpsichord building and to make their instruments prized throughout the world. How America, the technological giant of modern times, became a center for the ancient art of harpsichord building is a fascinating story that began many years, indeed centuries ago. Harpsichords come in an astonishing variety of sizes, shapes, and decorations. Some are large and elegant. Others are small and relatively simple. Some were designed for palaces, others for the parlors or music rooms of successful merchants. Their variety illustrates the ingenuity and tastes of the societies that created them. Large 18th century harpsichords have 2 keyboards and 3 or more sets of strings. The earliest harpsichords were probably simple box-like instruments that had keyboards something like the organettos, and wooden soundboards rather like the psalteries. Regardless of size or shape, all harpsichords produce their characteristic plucking sound in the same way. The jacks, which rest on the end of the keys, contain the plucking mechanism. Each time a key is struck, the jack is thrust upward and plucks a string with its protruding plectrum or quill. As we see on this model, the rise of the jack is stopped by the jack rail. It falls, its plectrum slips under the string, and its felt damper stills the string. Hitting a key harder does not make a note louder. It makes the jacks clatter. The best touch has the control and clarity needed for highly ornamented and polyphonic music. The harpsichord has many nuances of tone. The upper keyboard, for example, has a different timbre than the lower because it plucks its strings at a slightly different point. If a builder makes his instrument too heavy, he will lose the nuances of sound that are a harpsichord's special glory. If he makes his framing too light, however, it may warp under the stress of the tightened strings. Builders like John Lake have learned that they can achieve the desired lightness and stability of framing by using centuries-old methods. Every joint in the case of an instrument must be rock steady. If dovetails are used, they must fit together tightly so that wood meshes with wood. And most of the glue is squeezed out when the joint is clamped. Long after the glue fails, the joint will hold. Lake fastens the rim and interior bracings to the sides of his harpsichord with wooden nails because the body of a harpsichord is like the body of a violin or lute, a resonating chamber, and Lake wants that chamber to be made completely out of wood. Not long ago, many harpsichords were built with plywood sides and soundboards for stability. But the cross-grained laminates of plywood do not permit the resonance and openness of sound that natural wood does. Well-seasoned wood will shrink, swell, even bow slightly at different times of the year, but within acceptable tolerances, and it will regain its shape if temperature and humidity are controlled. At Dowd's shop, bent sides for the case are formed out of natural wood by the traditional method of steaming a board and clamping it on a curved form. A method that has its moments of dramatic suspense and comic relief. After a board has been carefully clamped down, It must be left to dry on the form for several weeks. It will then continue to hold its desired shape when removed, but it must be used before it begins to straighten out again. The interior bracings of Lake's harpsichord are almost identical to those in 18th century French harpsichords. Because these bracings are utterly secure, Lake can taper a portion of the bent side to see if this brings out the treble more fully. Italian harpsichords, like this Rodolphi in the Yale University collection, have very thin sides that need the protection of an outer case. Lightly strung, they have a crisp, dry tone that made them ideal as accompanying instruments. By the close of the 16th century, the beauty of the harpsichord as a solo instrument was fully realized in the music of Girolamo Frescobaldi, the great organist of St. Peter's in Rome. Elizabethan composers created the first great body of solo literature for the harpsichord, or virginals as they commonly called it. Hundreds of Elizabethan pieces have come down to us, many with an irresistible strain of tender melancholy, like The Last Part of the Old Year. Henry VIII had 22 harpsichords at court. Elizabeth was a skilled player for whom William Byrd wrote The Queen's Almond. Some of the best harpsichords owned by Elizabethans were made by Rookers, the great Flemish dynasty of builders. Larger, heavier than Italian harpsichords, Rookers have a richer, more singing tone. Italian builders preferred unison strings. Rookers harpsichords more often have one set of strings tuned an octave higher than the other, a 4-foot stop that brightens the 8 when added to it. The buff stop on Flemish harpsichords damped the strings close to the tuning pins, creating a sound much like a lute's. When the Rookers made Antwerp a center of harpsichord building that rivaled Italy, the Netherlands was a prosperous nation. A nation of great painters whose canvases bear witness to the popularity of the harpsichord. Pleased to be painted at the keyboard, the young Flemish women who posed enjoyed such pieces as Under the Greenwood Tree by Jan Svelink. Many antique harpsichords were exquisitely painted. What set the Rookers apart was their beauty of tone. Their soundboards, which were coveted by later builders, were tapered to extraordinary thinness. Then, as now, soundboards had to be dried thoroughly before being installed, lest they crack in low humidity. The putting in of a soundboard is a crucial step in the building of an instrument. The work must go swiftly because hot glue, which dries rapidly, is used. Moving easily around the go bar, all the workers at Dowd's join in to make certain that the soundboard is firmly pressed against its supporting rim before the glue begins to set. Care is taken that even pressures are exerted at all points. the time-consuming jobs at Dowd's is the preparation of the registers, the narrow slotted strips of wood that position the jacks by the strings they pluck. Each register consists of a jack slide and a lower guide. When the registers have been precisely fashioned, they are covered with a thin layer of leather to quiet and control the movement of the jacks. It is vitally important that the jacks fit properly in the registers. If the fit is tight, the jacks may bind. If the fit is loose, the plucking action of the jacks will be erratic. Like 18th century French builders, Dowd cuts the openings in the registers somewhat wider than the leather that lines them, so that the jacks slide against leather, not wood, as they move. Another refinement of French builders which Dowd uses is the carving out of the underside of the keys so that they have the needed balance with the lightest, most responsive touch possible. The creation in the 17th century of instruments with two expressive keyboards was a momentous step in the evolution of the harpsichord, because it gave performers two different tone colors to use in a single piece of music. Two expressive keyboards allowed composers to write intricate pieces which cannot be performed on a single manual. As the model shows, the upper keyboard, shoved forward, couples with the lower. The coupled keyboards have a unique depth of sound and timbre. A performer can use the coupled lower keyboard against the upper for dynamic contrasts. Like the Rookers of Flanders, the Tascans of France were a great dynasty of builders. The sonorities of their instruments, like this one in the Yale collection, were marvelously suited to the qualities of French keyboard music, which reached its zenith in the late 17th and 18th centuries when the Tascans were building. Among the greatest composers for the harpsichord was François Couperin. Strand's music is intimately linked to the court of Louis XIV at Versailles. It is elegant, highly sophisticated, aristocratic. But it would be a mistake to think that the harpsichord was abandoned because its music grew frivolous or decadent. On the contrary, the very last stage of the harpsichord was its most vital and glorious. In France, Jean-Philippe Rameau was composing. In England, George Frederick Handel. In Spain, Domenico Scarlatti. In Germany, Johann Sebastian Bach. But even as Bach was writing his polyphonic masterworks, the forte piano was evolving from a musical curiosity into a keyboard instrument that would intrigue Haydn and Mozart. At first, they wrote their music for harpsichord or piano, but the great keyboard works of their maturity were written for the piano alone. As musical tastes changed, the harpsichord seemed more and more limited. The future belonged to the piano, whose dynamic and expressive possibilities were to be exploited by Beethoven and his fellow romantics. By Chopin's time, harpsichords were no longer being built. For centuries, painters had portrayed women at the harpsichord. In 19th century canvases, only the piano appears. Yet a historical interest in the harpsichord began to grow, and in the 1880s, French piano makers started to build harpsichords. A leading figure in the harpsichord revival was the scholar-performer Arnold Dolmetsch, who came to America in 1907 to build instruments at the Chickering Piano Factory. Sales were disappointing, and in 1911, Dolmetsch went back to England. Harpsichord building returned to America in 1930, when John Challis, who had apprenticed with Dolmetsch, opened his own shop. An inventive genius, Challis perfected hard rubber jacks and a cast aluminum frame to make his instruments as reliable as possible. But even as harpsichords, especially those built by piano makers, were coming more and more to resemble pianos, the restoration of antique instruments was leading builders back to historical models. Hubbard and Dowd, who apprenticed with Dolmetsch and Challis respectively, remember the excitement of taking apart old harpsichords and discovering how they were built and worked. The more they learned, the more they appreciated the functional simplicity of early instruments. They realized also that many modern harpsichords, though superbly engineered, were not especially suited to perform the very music that was their reason for existence. Before they could build replicas of historical instruments, Hubbard and Dowd had to learn to make accurate, detailed drawings of the antique harpsichords they were able to examine. With modifications, these drawings became the working plans for their own instruments. Next, they had to build replicas of antique harpsichords to prove to themselves and others that the seemingly fragile construction and mechanisms of such instruments could stand up to the American climate, steam heating, and transportation in trucks and planes. Where Challis adapted the harpsichord to 20th century conditions, Hubbard and Dowd educated performers to the need to care for, tune, and regulate their own instruments. Harpsichords based on antique models have proven so stable that Dowd will make wooden jacks if a customer requests them, though he prefers, like other builders, to mold jacks out of Delrin. Even his wooden jacks have plectra made of Delrin, a modern plastic that lasts longer and is far more readily available than Raven's quill. The return to historical principles has not fixed harpsichord building in an unchanging past. Builders still try to refine their instruments, and they are responsive to the needs of performers. A recent innovation is the transposing keyboard, which easily moves from modern pitch to the lower pitch needed for accompanying Baroque woodwinds and viols. This kind of transposing keyboard is unhistorical, yet it allows players to recapture more fully the musical heritage and performance practices of the past. The love of the past is apparent in John Lake's use of wooden nails and his pleasure in laying out his keyboards in traditional fashion.
The appreciation of the past I got in Holland as a young boy, working in all kinds of old organs. So the feeling for old instruments I had before I started building harpsichords. Well, in a certain way, I quite often have that feeling. That is a kind of thing that is born inside of you, or maybe the way we were playing in the streets, with all the old buildings and old houses, old ships we were on, sailboats going by, dikes we played on, what kept us all the time in relationship with the past.
Love of the past drew Frank Hubbard to the harpsichord.
Of course, my personal interest in the past was the reason I entered the field in the first place. For me, I suppose it's a form of escapism. The contemporary world is very unpleasant in many ways. And we, of course, have constructed an idealization of what we think of the past as having been. Everything was supposed to have been beautiful, and everybody was acted like human beings. Of course, this wasn't true, but we like to believe it, that towns were quaint and lovely, and all of the ugly things in the past have disappeared in this idealization. My motive, certainly, as a young man, was to enter this past as completely as possible, to know as much about it as possible. And in the end, I chose harpsichord making because it seemed to be a field that would allow me to conduct historical research, in other words, to enter this past, in a field which had not been overrun by other investigators.
Hubbard knows we do not escape the present when we seek to recreate the past.
History is guesswork. Anybody's concept of history is based on the world he lives in. I attempt to enter the world of the past in my imagination. It's one of my favorite pastimes. But I don't think anybody can pretend ever to have succeeded entirely. If you look at any artifact which is a copy of an artifact from the past, you'll discover that you can always date the copy. It always looks like the time it came from, no matter how slavishly it's followed an original.
William Dowd sometimes wonders why so many people want to build harpsichords.
I wish I knew. I got afflicted by the same thing 25 years ago. I don't think it's changed any for them. I looked at one, fell in love with it, felt I can make that, and started. I didn't really know how to make it, but I thought I could. It's something very beautiful, and does look handmade.
Dowd is certain that interest in the harpsichord is not limited to a small select circle.
I think it's larger. I really think it's larger than that. It attracts an enormous number of people who, well, I can't understand the attraction to them. Now, of the people that make it, they are quite special people. They're not necessarily great, deep intellectuals, but they are people who have fallen in love with the craft to the exclusion of doing anything else. This is what they want to do most. And they're sufficiently historically minded to learn what they're doing and really learn what they're doing. I mentioned earlier that many people want to become harpsichord makers because they like the lifestyle. Those are the ones that are almost sure to fail.
Harpsichord building is not for dilettantes or dreamers. It demands a practical knowledge of tools and materials.
Well, any instrument maker, any harpsichord maker has to deal with the real world. I have to deal with things. Yes, of course, I have to understand relative humidity and shrinking and swelling of wood. I have to understand the physics of sound. I have to understand something about mechanics to invent machines or tools to make parts. I suppose all of this comes under the heading of mechanical aptitude. I tend to go on learning about it the whole time. I've always had a hobby of reading things like the Scientific American. At the moment I'm reading a series of benchmark papers in acoustics, but I don't regard myself as a scientist by any stretch of the imagination.
For Hubbard, there is no conflict between technology and art in building harpsichords.
Well, they're the same. You're expressing an artistic concept in a technological medium. And after all, Bach, in a sense, felt that when he said that in playing the organ, that you pressed a key and the organ did the rest. You're dealing with a machine to make music when you're making a harpsichord, obviously.
Hubbard hopes that study of the harpsichord can provide a focus for broader humanistic interests.
I'm very much interested in the history of technology. I'm very much interested in social history. At the moment, as a matter of fact, I'm planning to give a course at Harvard which will be concerned with the harpsichord. The harpsichord will be the central issue, but we will use that as a point of entry to the social, economic, technological, and musical history of the time that the harpsichord existed. So that I think the harpsichord for me has done the same thing. It's broadened my interest to almost any aspect of the past. This course will have the advantage, obviously, of attracting people from many different fields. We can use scientists, we can use economists, we can use social historians, we can use musicologists. The students in this course, if I can be a bit redundant, will assemble a kit that we're supplying, so that we'll actually have practical experience making harpsichords. Therefore, it obviously will attract...
Hubbard, Lake, and Dowd are certain that the vogue of the harpsichord will not fade because each year more Americans are discovering it on records and in live performances.
Growing by leaps and bounds. When I started working 25 years ago, it was a comparatively rare thing for any of us to apply to work for the then few existing makers. In this country, there was only one maker, and I was one person in 4 or 5 years that applied to work with him. And now we have, in this shop alone, 2 to 3 applications a week. And I'm sure the same is true of Frank Hubbard's shop or most of the other shops. It never occurred to me that things would become like they are now. There are more people in most universities who want to study the harpsichord, that is, as players. In most music schools, more people want to do this than they want to play the piano. It has replaced the piano as the home keyboard instrument. for the amateur. The attraction of the Baroque literature for these people, I think partly it's easy and they can learn to play it well. It's fairly hard for any amateur to learn to play the Liszt B minor sonata well, or any of the big Chopin pieces, Brahms, or Beethoven for that matter. If that may be part of it, I don't know.
In recent years, harpsichord building in America has taken two distinctly different paths. Large custom-built instruments, purchased by orchestras, schools, and serious players, have become increasingly expensive. Because antique harpsichords were more often painted than finished in natural woods, the majority of harpsichords now are painted and gilded, and the taste for elaborate decoration is growing. One can order beautifully painted soundboards. Elegantly fashioned trestles. Even lids painted with Flemish landscapes, if one can afford the price. But the harpsichord is not becoming a luxury which only wealthy Americans can afford. Because more and more builders like Hubbard are selling inexpensive kits of historical instruments. The mass production and mass marketing techniques that make inexpensive kits possible may annoy purists. But the kit harpsichord is a happy example of American ingenuity, one that places modern industrial techniques in the service of art and individual craftsmanship. Hubbard's newest kit will be a replica of this spinet by the English builder Baker Harris, which was sent to the American colonies in 1765 for John Collins, who was later to become governor of Rhode Island. Several years later, the English builder John Harris moved to America and in 1769 announced the availability of his instruments in the Boston Gazette. In 1788, Francis Hopkinson, composer and inventor, published a paper in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society on an improved method of quilling a harpsichord. Hopkinson, who corresponded with Thomas Jefferson about his plans to improve the harpsichord, would be pleased to know that American builders, wedding modern technology to historical tradition, have helped to make the harpsichord and its music live again in the 20th century. We dedicate this film to the memory of Frank Hubbard.